NASA thinks now's the perfect time to check out Venus, especially after news about possible life there. Funny enough, if you look back at NASA's old stuff from the 60s, they called Venus a lost cause. Back then, Mars was the place to be. But naming planets like that wasn't random. During the intense space race, the Soviet Union was super into sending missions to Venus, even though it didn't seem like life could exist there. They stuck with it until their empire fell. Thanks to Neil deGrasse Tyson, we kinda know why. Let's look at some old photos from Venus that the Soviets made public. The Soviet Union's collapse was a big deal. It changed the world and buried a bunch of secrets. The Soviets loved secrets. They had a crazy good spy agency and were hush-hush about possible alien contact. Before the US dominated space, the Soviet Union was the top dog. They sent missions to space, but they were really fixated on Venus. In Russian, Venus is Venera, hence the name of their secret mission from 1961 to 1983. While the US was landing on the moon, the Soviets put their resources elsewhere. But why Venus? Were they thinking about a military base, or maybe even colonizing it if they found life? It's hard to say because they weren't exactly open about their plans during the Cold War. All we know about these missions comes from old, declassified stuff. Even then, it's hard to know what they were looking for or if they found anything. The Soviets didn't just land on Venus once or twice. They sent 28 rockets, 13 made it into the atmosphere, and 8 landed successfully. These missions put them way ahead in space. The US was second, but NASA was more into satellites than finding life on other planets. Their interest in Mars came later. Your history book might not say this, but the Soviets were the first to send a probe into another planet's atmosphere. They also had a bunch of other firsts. They were the first to land softly on another planet and send back pictures and sounds. They had their own one small step moment before the US. So why don't we hear about this stuff? Remember how the Soviets loved secrets? That's one reason. In 1992, their space program shut down after the USSR fell, and it was restarted as Roscosmos. A lot of old info was lost or destroyed. That's why we don't know exactly why the Soviets released the photos or what they really show. Maybe exploring Venus was just cheaper. That doesn't mean they didn't hope to find life. They looked for water, solar power, and other stuff. Without these missions, we wouldn't know about Venus's hot temps and thick atmosphere. These days, many scientists doubt life could survive there. It's hot enough to melt lead, and water is rare. The air pressure is also crazy high. Despite this, the USSR's work on Venus is still important. For the Soviets, Venus was worth it, even if it was just to beat the US in the space race. It wasn't that they didn't think about Mars, it was just more expensive. Venus is only 40 million kilometers away, while Mars is 250 million kilometers away. That's a huge cost difference. If the US wasn't so rich, they probably couldn't have explored Mars either. Some say the Soviet missions weren't reliable and had problems. They lost contact with rockets a lot. So, it makes sense they went for the shorter, easier trip. If we don't talk about the space race, the Venus missions don't make as much sense. The US wasn't even in the game when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957. This made the space race even more intense. But why did the US focus on the moon? Well, NASA had a rough time with Venus in the 60s. They just couldn't get it right. So, the Soviet Union saw a chance to take advantage. Both countries wanted to win the space race. They just went different routes. The Soviets went for Venus because the US was failing at it. Despite having fewer resources and a shaky government, the Soviets kept sending missions to Venus to show up the US. To hide their Venus fails, the US called Venus a terrible, ungodly, awful place, while Mars became the next great hope. The Soviets didn't care. They wanted to prove they were better, and they kinda did. The Venus missions are almost forgotten now, but they were seriously complex and ambitious. If we had to pick one thing that kicked off the space age, the Venus missions would be it. Back in the 50s, the Soviets started messing around with probe designs. For the next 30 years, they built and launched spacecraft as part of the Venus program. They were trying to save time/money during the Cold War. Luckily, they had bigger rockets than the US early on. The Soviets started building bigger rockets that could handle high altitudes and long distances. They tested both manned and unmanned spacecraft. Meanwhile, scientists were figuring out the best routes to Venus. They were also working on Mars stuff. The most important thing was making good instruments for these probes. In 1966, they launched Venera 3, which became the first probe to enter Venus's atmosphere and touch the surface. This made the competition even fiercer. While the US kept failing, the Soviets kept moving forward. They launched successful probes into Venus's atmosphere, but they had design issues. They fixed those and launched better rockets in the 70s. They even launched 2 probes at once. Some say this was the most interesting time in space. Sure, the US tried to do the same thing. Why did the Soviets launch 2 at once? Because going to other planets requires good instruments to get lots of data. The first probe checked out the planet's surface. That's what Venera 4 did. Since it went well, they launched Venera 5. It wasn't just a repeat. It was designed to collect different data about the planet. The Soviets wanted to push through the hot temps, pressure, and radiation on Venus. By the mid-70s, the Soviet program was getting really good. They had been researching and testing stuff, making sure their designs and technologies were good. They were also perfecting how to travel to other planets. In the second part of the Venus missions they wanted to explore, the coolest launch was Venera 7. It sent data back from another planet for the first time ever. They already knew about the hot temps, density, and pressure. Now they wanted to record sounds. In the mid-80s, Venera 13 took color photos of Venus's surface. They also launched Venera 14 to get similar info. Since the Soviet Union was one of the first to study Venus, the Russian Space Agency is planning new Venus missions. Venerad is a joint mission between Russia and NASA to study Venus's atmosphere and surface. It should launch in the late 2020s or mid-2030s. It'll study the planet's atmosphere, history, and look for signs of life. It will have a satellite, a lander, and maybe even an inflatable to study the planet. The Venus missions were more than just technology and competition. They showed how creative and determined humans can be when exploring the universe. Even though things were hard, the Soviets kept trying to understand Venus, a planet everyone thought was awful and deadly. One of the best parts of the Venus missions was using mechanical probes to study planets. These missions set the stage for going beyond Earth and helped us learn about planets. The data they collected taught us about Venus's crazy climate, hot temps, high pressure, and toxic air. The Soviets didn't just land on Venus once or twice. They sent 28 rockets there, 13 made it into the atmosphere, and 8 landed safely. These trips put them way ahead in space stuff. The US was second, but NASA was more into satellites and new tech than looking for life on other planets. They got excited about Mars later. Your history book might not say this, but the Soviet space program sent the first probe into another planet's atmosphere. They also were the first to land softly on another planet and send back photos and sounds. So, the Soviets had their one small step moment way before the US. Why don't we hear about these big missions? Well, the Soviets like to keep things secret. Plus, when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1992, the space program shut down and came back as Roscosmos in Russia. A lot of old info got lost or destroyed, so we don't know exactly why the Soviets took those pictures. But if we had to guess, exploring Venus was cheaper. That doesn't mean they weren't hoping to find life. They looked for water, solar power, and what the planet was generally like. Without these missions, it would have been almost impossible to figure out how hot Venus is and how thick its atmosphere is. Now, most scientists don't think Venus can support life because it's too hot and dry, and the atmosphere is super thick with crazy pressure. But we can't forget what the Soviets did to explore Venus. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth checking out, even if it was just to beat the US in the space race. Sure, they wanted to check out planets that could support life like Mars, but that cost more than sending stuff to Venus. It all comes down to how far away a planet is. Venus is only about 40 million kilometers away, while Mars is about 250 million kilometers away. That makes a big difference in cost. Plus, if the US didn't have a big economy, they wouldn't have been able to explore Mars. Some say the Soviet missions weren't that great and had problems. They lost contact with rockets a lot. So, it makes sense that they picked a shorter, closer trip that would get them some results. If we don't talk about the space race, though, the story of the Van Era missions isn't complete. The United States was not present on the space race when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. It's interesting why the U.S. focused on the moon. NASA had a hard time with its Venus missions in the 60s. Every time they sent a probe, something went wrong. Then the Soviet Union saw a chance to take the lead. Both countries wanted to win the space race. The smart thing was to try different things. The Soviet space program went for Venus in order to achieve a milestone in the space race. Even though they didn't have a lot of money and their government was struggling, they kept sending missions to Venus to win against the U.S. Instead of focusing on the moon like NASA, this split caused some arguments. To hide their Venus failures, the U.S. called Venus the hellish planet. While Mars became man's destiny, these labels didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to prove they were better than the Americans, and they did it. The Van Era missions are kind of forgotten. Still, they were complex and ambitious. If we had to pick one thing that started the space age, it would be the Van Era missions. Back in the 50s, the Soviets started playing around with the design and tech of the probes, and they continued to build spacecraft for the next 30 years. The Soviets were careful about how they used their money. Luckily, they could lift heavier things than the U.S. They built bigger rockets that could handle high altitudes and long distances. The Soviets tried both manned and unmanned spacecraft. They did research to plan out the Venus missions. They were also working on Mars programs. The most main thing for the Soviet Space Agency was making complex stuff for these probes. In 1966, they launched Van Era 3, the first probe to enter Venus's atmosphere and touch the surface. This amped up the competition between the two. Unlike the American missions, which kept failing, the Soviet program kept making progress. The issue was design. The Soviets solved their design problems and launched the most advanced rockets of the Van Era program in the 1970s. This led them to launch Van Era 4 and Van Era 5 at the same time. The U.S. tried to do something similar. Interplanetary travel requires advanced tools to collect information. The spacecraft surveyed the planet's surface. This is what happened with Van Era 4. Since that launch went well, they launched Van Era 5, which was made to collect specific data. Soviets were trying to get past the problems of temperature, pressure, and radiation on Venus. It only took a brief period for them to get answers. In the mid-1970s, the Soviet program was in a good spot. All they had done was about research and ensuring their designs were good. For the next decade of Van Era missions, the Soviets wanted to do exploration. One successful launch was Van Era 7. When the probe entered Venus's atmosphere, it was the first spacecraft to send data from another planet. The planet's temperatures, density, and pressures were noted. The Soviets were trying to record noises from Venus. Later, in the mid-1980s, Van Era 13 gathered color photos of Venus's surface. The Soviets also launched Van Era 14 to gather more planet data. The Russian Space Agency wants new Venus missions. Vanarad is a planned mission between Roscosmos and NASA to explore Venus's atmosphere and surface. This mission is expected to launch in the late 2020s or mid-2030s and aims to study the planet's atmosphere, geological history, and search for signs of any ongoing or past the ability. The spacecraft will include an orbiter, a lander, and possibly an inflatable to study the planet's environment. The Van Era missions were complex projects. These missions showed what people can do when they try to explore the universe. The Soviets kept trying to unlock Venus's mysteries. The Van Era missions used probes to study planets. This helped us go beyond Earth and understand more about science. The info from the Van Era spacecraft taught us about Venus's environment, including how hot it is, how much pressure it has, and the toxic atmosphere. Tech from the Van Era program also helped with space exploration overall. Developing materials and landing techniques were helpful. The lessons from the Van Era missions still help with spacecraft design.